Question 5, Honourable Member for Council, Mrs Lord-Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. I would like to ask the Minister for the Environment, Food and Agriculture how funding and resources are allocated in order to exercise the various regulatory functions within DEFA.
Call on the Minister to reply. Mr Burt.
Thank you, Mr President. I can advise that there are many officers throughout the department who have a regulatory role: fisheries officers, planning officers, environment protection unit officers, etc. However, for the most part, I have concentrated on answering the question specifically within the Regulation Directorate, as I have assumed that this is the area in which the Honourable Member is seeking further advice or information. The Regulation Directorate was formed in 2019 following a departmental restructure and further to the administrative merger and co-location of both the Office of Fair Trading and the Road Transport Licensing Committee within DEFA. Budgets were established at that time and continue to be honed with advice from Treasury officers to meet work demands within the Directorate. The Directorate comprises a staffing resource of 64, most of whom require a specialist qualification in order to carry out their job. The current budget for the Directorate is $3.272 million. This provides for all necessary resources to carry out regulatory functions in the divisions within the Directorate, and I've asked for a table to be circulated detailing a breakdown of this after this sitting. As I have already mentioned, there is a requirement for many officers working within the Directorate's various divisions to hold qualifications and competencies necessary to fulfil their respective regulatory roles. Therefore, there is little scope to move officers within the divisions. Accordingly, the department has to consider the regulatory requirements of all the divisions to ensure there is adequate staffing resource to provide levels of service as required by statutes, policies and emerging demands such as Brexit as dictated and that the general public expects and deserves. Thank you.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Mr President. I thank the Minister for his answer. For those regulatory functions that are happening within the Regulatory Directorate, do those functions and those officers carrying out those jobs have to compete with each other for funding and resources, or compete with the department, or are they getting access to the specific budgeted amounts that they might expect and need to carry out their functions?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. Each regulatory function obviously has a budget attached to it. In terms of the OFT, that is a slightly different arrangement. They have a service level agreement with an allocation of resources. They don't compete directly. If they have a business case for various functions that aren't being carried out, or there are requirements over and above what they're doing at present, then that is examined on an annual basis and budgeted for accordingly.
Further supplementary, Mr Lord-Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. How does the service level agreement reflect access to funding and resources? Are there service level agreements in place for any other regulatory functions? And if not, why is the Office of Fair Trading different?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. The Office of Fair Trading came to the department 3 years ago. It was transferred with a budget of $695,000, and that has steadily increased to $742,000, allowing for salary inflation. There is a service level agreement with the OFT because it sits in but outside. We provide officers and administrative oversight. You, I think, and Mr Perkins are the chair and vice chair of the board. But we supply the officer support for that. If the OFT in particular feels that it is under-resourced, and I believe that the amount of staff engaged are comparable with when it was taken over, then if they produce a business case, we will take that to Treasury in due course. With regard to the RTLC, that sits with an administrative function within DEFA. We provide the officers for that, and the board or committee sits separately, and we have no contact or information or any input into that committee as such. We just provide them an administrative function.
Final supplementary, Mrs Lord-Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. Is it then the case that effectively access to some resources and funding is requiring a departmental yes or no in some of these instances for the OFT, for example? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. So, as I said earlier, each regulatory function requires a budget and a number of officers. That sits within the budget for the Directorate and the Department as a whole, and that is examined on an annual basis. And if business cases come forward for increases perhaps in staffing levels or in some cases for equipment, specialist equipment, where regulatory functions include that, then obviously that is dealt with through the department.